Let's bring in our panel now. David Gazzard from DPG Advisory, a former Liberal advisor, and Ben Oquist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute and former advisor with the Greens. Ben, we find you today in Europe. You're on your way to Glasgow, as I understand it, for the climate talks. What do you make of the government's plan? The Prime Minister has landed a deal and he's been praised already by the host of the climate talks, Boris Johnson, Ben.
It's a good place to be. I mean, in Rome, the G20 is coming up this weekend, then en route to Glasgow. It is a good place to get some perspective because I don't think the policy has gone down well internationally. I'll put it simply, is that the COP president, picked by Boris Johnson, says this is the time we need to consign coal to history. The UN Secretary General, of course, the boss's boss, if you like, says that OECD countries, he's gone further, have to get off coal this decade by 2030. And I think, of course, that's where the rubber hits the road. And I think this is the big disconnect between what the Prime Minister's announced. I've just been reading the Financial Times this morning. It says, Australia is still wedded to fossil fuels. And this is the decisive decade that Joe Biden says. So I think the Prime Minister is going to have a tough time internationally at the G20. Australia is one of the worst performing countries in the G20 when it comes to climate change, continually ranks at the bottom there. And then in Glasgow, where all the action is on 2030. And I think the danger for the Prime Minister, Glasgow's under some pressure. The level of commitments is not enough to solve climate change at the moment. So Glasgow, to be a success, needs people to step up. And it is under some pressure. You're hearing that from Boris Johnson. I think the danger for the Prime Minister now going to Glasgow is he could be seen as a wrecker of Glasgow and part of the problem in trying to make Glasgow succeed. And I think that's a big worry, not just politically for the Prime Minister, but of course for the globe.
David Gazzard, your reaction to that warning from Ben, is that a realistic threat, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's more of the same, isn't it? I mean, Ben worked for the Greens and the Australia Institute. They're always going to push for more. They've said we wouldn't meet Kyoto targets. We met them. They've said we wouldn't meet the Paris commitments, which are absolutely essential, and we met those and surpassed them easily. And after demanding net zero by 2050, they're now saying we have to do more or we're wreckers. So the question now really moves from Scott Morrison, who's delivered a deal. And let's face it, that deal did come with some heartache for the Conservative side of politics. But the great thing about the deal was everyone kicked the tyres on it the whole way through. It's been well thought out. It's been well argued. It's rational. And it's been released. So the question now, forget Glasgow. Everyone knows that Australia's going with a net zero plan. The question now is for the other side of politics to come up with, here's our plan and here's what it's going to cost. So if anything, this week has been instrumental in exposing the Labor Party for taking a policy to the last election that included no cost. Forget the modelling. It had no cost. No one understood what that would cost, and they viewed it with suspicion. At least there's some certainty now revolving around what the cost of these plans are. And if Labor says this is inadequate and the Greens are saying it's inadequate, they are incumbent, or it's incumbent on them to come up with the costs that Australians are going to have to bear. So reading the Financial Times is one thing, and talking about what the world thinks of Australia is quite another. But Australians have to make up their mind on who's going to protect their jobs, who's going to protect the economy going forward, and who's going to meet their climate commitments, which, according to the Greens just a few years ago, were going to be satisfied with net zero by 2050.
And Ben, to you on that, your response, because the fact is the Prime Minister does have those domestic considerations, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, very sensitive considerations, particularly when it comes to the junior coalition partner, but more broadly, he's got to meet the expectations of the Australian electorate as well.
Of course, and you saw the Prime Minister beginning his new pitch politically, wasn't he, by having a go at those who were suggesting we needed more certainty with these targets and legislating them. And he's got his political agenda now revved up about suggesting that if you legislated to lock in targets and guarantee them, you'd be mandating what people could or couldn't do. You know, it had rings again of the 2019 election campaign when he said that wanting to have an electric vehicle policy meant you were going to wreck the weekend or end the weekend or lose your barbecue. And I expect we're going to see more of that. But I'm not, of course, there's political considerations, but I think we do need to see some kind of global leadership happening at the moment. And I know David thinks that the Prime Minister can do no wrong, but it's not about what was said in the past and meeting and beating lowly targets that were never good enough and that were based on cheating. It's really about where the world is at now and where we are at on climate change now. Africa risks a 15% hit to GDP this decade because of the effects of climate change, sending 100 million people more into poverty. And Glasgow does matter. I know David wants to take it back just to what Labor's policy is going to be at the election, but Glasgow matters to solving those big problems, poverty, climate change disasters, a massive hit to GDP in Africa, unless we do something this decade, and we have to get off coal this decade. And so I think Glasgow and the G20 do matter in kind of putting pressure on all countries, Australia included, in a way, of course, that Australia has to manage politically. But I do think that global pressure has had some impact on the Prime Minister. That's why he's moved to net zero by 2050. But I think even Paul Kelly was being polite when he said it was a little bit light on policy detail. And they've said, he's boasted, that there are no new policies to go with that. And I think that's what's really missing, as well as the lack of ambition to get off fossil fuels.
David Gazzard, yesterday, the comments from the Prime Minister, he said that he framed the language about saying who do you trust to manage this and save people's jobs and so on. I had a bit of a deja vu moment, David, going back to 2004, John Howard in August of that year. Sounded very similar, the language, when he launched that successful election campaign. But you get a sense of where the PM's heading as he faces his own re-election not too far away, David.
Look, and for all the reasons we've just had in this interview, I mean, we've moved from net zero by 2050 to saving Africa's GDP and taking the world out of poverty, but we won't tell you how much that will cost. And by the way, we're also going to eliminate fossil fuels in the transition period. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why every Australian can figure that out, to say, this is why we do trust you with looking after your jobs, looking after your industries while we go through a transition. I think most Australians would also realise that this is 30 years out into the future. You look 30 years in the past, he held up his mobile phone in the Parliament today. You know, mobile phones didn't exist then. Australians recognise that technology is moving at a rapid pace, but there is a transition period to make sure that we keep important jobs and industries functioning here. Now, Africa's important, global poverty is important, but this is the point, isn't it? We can all demand to save the world, but it's incumbent to explain to people what is the cost of doing that. And that's what's happened this week. There's been a plan that's been thrashed out with some heartburn, as I said, but at least it's a plan and it lays out a roadmap to get to 2050.
David, appreciate it. Ben, safe travels. See you soon. Thanks for your company.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.